Good morning. I will be speaking about misuse of religion from a different point of view. Don't worry, I am still keeping to the topic. Yeah. My question will be if we can speak about the misuse of religion from a point of view of someone like me who does not look at religion from inside, but who looks at the return of religious actors into the political sphere. And I will make a reflection about the role of religion in so-called culture wars, something that actually brings us away from Ukraine and Belarus and Russia back to our Central European or European context. So the problem I face as a political scientist is the fact that in contemporary politics we see a lot of religious talk, religious arguments, religious activism. And my question will be, can we at some point speak about a misuse of religion? I have in mind very specifically the so-called culture wars, which I will define. The fact that since around 2013, we've seen in Central Europe a very important involvement of not necessarily always churches, but mostly professionalized and transnationally collected civil society organizations of religious inspiration, sometimes of religion affiliation in politics, and we have seen their increased coalition that sometimes very specifically very parties of the populist radical right. My most important issue with that I will be our point of departure is that in this new phenomena, these religious actors not only are present in politics, which is not a problem of itself, but they actually have a discourse on rights. They sometimes stand against rights and they try to redefine rights. And also they bring into the political discourse certain anti-modernist points. So this is the issue I will be tackling. And the question will be, can we speak about abuse or misuse and how to interpret this phenomena? I will first define the culture wars and this problem. Then I will have two different reflections of misuse how to speak about misuse or think about misuse, and actually whether it should be not better interpret this return of religion as a certain strategy. And I'll conclude with an answer. So the context is not a return of religion. We are in a moment in which political cleavages and conflicts around the world, not only in Central Europe, but in Europe in general, more and more turn around various conflicts about norms and symbols, and in which political cleavages tend to get articulated less in terms of socio-economic differences and programmatic differences, and more around cultural issues, around symbols, not in Central Europe, often religious, but even more so, more often so national symbols, about values, for example, about the way we define liberty and equality, and about social norms, meaning social hierarchies, various norms such as marriage, and identities. Religions are very much involved in this. Meaning religions, I mean concrete churches or very concrete civil society organizations. We've seen, and this happens this globally. It's a global phenomenon, starting possibly in the USA with the Baptist evangelicals and their fight against various how would I say, phenomena of the post 1960 world. Catholic traditionalists in Europe and their fight against gender equality, and obviously Orthodox churches and their fight against so-called Western liberalism. So it's nothing very specific to Europe or Central Europe. What I would define as a specific issue where we could actually speak about a misuse of religion, and I will be asking this question, is the way in which religious actors, I mean parts of churches, not whole churches, and a lot of these civil society organizations actually intervene in the political discourse and in political in political mobilization on behalf of rights, or more concretely, on behalf of making certain rights non-acceptable, not possible, or framing them as illegitimate. And when I will not be going into details, even though it would be another topic, another interesting topic. Most interesting and most important are various discursive shifts that we see that happen under the influence of religious actors. To be very concrete, the legal personhood of the fetus is a big issue in the US, in Poland recently also, and it also can happen here, which actually is a position that puts women's autonomy, that is pitted very openly against the idea of women's individual autonomy. Second big issue is parental rights over the idea that children should be socialized in state schools. In some ways, a very legitimate debate, in various ways, a discourse that shifts the idea of rights, or the concept of rights, giving from the child to the parents. And in principle, and I'm going very quickly over it, in principle we see a tendency to delegitimize or limit the principle of equality, which is an underlying principle of the human rights, in favor of an idea that is religiously formulated of complementarity of sexes. And we see a strong shift towards particularism or nativism, nationally or civilizationally defined, against universality. So these are the problems that the issues that we're facing. And now I will be, I've painted them very generally. Now I will be, these examples are the examples in which that you could all probably link with concrete civil society organizations in which they speak about Christian rights of Christian majority against a sort of dictatorship of minority. This is examples of discursive tools that go in this direction that I have described previously, for pushing our discourses from talk about rights towards manipulative self-victimization, shifts in discourse that articulate rights in ways that were not, that are very new, and that are in some ways they go in against the idea, for example, of social change and its organization through public policy, and then that return us to a discourse about, or debates about, that patriarchal moralism is again somehow a very present position in the public debate. We see discursive interventions that divide people between us as them, using religious language. This is something that you will be very much aware of, and also interventions that directly or indirectly reject certain epistemic positions that have been so far important in public and democratic debates. For example, the idea of social constructivism in favor of anti-modern naturalism. So these are the interventions that I could question. Are they misuse of religion? And as I was speaking here half a year ago or a year ago, the question of misuse of religion, this phrase is very difficult, because we would have to develop a very, we've seen this in the intervention of David Václavík. We would have to develop a firm normative perspectives. Theological one is not mine. I may have developed a democratic normative perspective on the misuse of religion. I will be giving in some arguments in this direction. But as you will see, this will not be so decisive. So I decided to actually take the perspective of theory of modernization, in which we, meaning focusing not on the moral or ethical or democratic or theological issue of misuse, but focusing on religion. So if we speak about misuse of religion, we have to have a theory of religion. A theory of religion comes with certain definition of religion that's dependent on modernization and secularization. And if we speak about the misuse of religion, then in which sense could we make sense of this phrase? So if we speak in a secularized, substantially secularized framework, then we could maybe speak about a misuse of religion, in which the secularized framework, meaning a framework of societies that have differentiated secular and religious spheres, that have developed a certain area of secularity from which you can discuss and you can also define what is religion. Then the religious could be defined as a place of transcendence and as a place of cosmological grand schemes that ground a certain moral outlook. And the secular, the framework in which we could actually speak of misuse would be our common frame of immanence, Charles Taylor's, in which we actually have some kind of grounding on moral and social science for our discourses, for our debates between us, that also include secular and also possibly religious actors who, in a substantial way, accept and accede to this secular language. And we also would have certain principles that we take as formative to the democratic reality, meaning individual autonomy, social constructivism, and this idea of social change. So from within the secular, we could actually judge whether what is religion and what would constitute misuse. And this will be a question I will be asking in less secularized settings, which is, I think, the setting of, for example, Russia, Belarus, or Ukraine, or most Orthodox countries. It's much more difficult to differentiate between political and religious communities, between political and religious orders. So, in the secularized setting, is this human culture wars a misuse of religion? And I still have a problem with it because what would be misuse? How could you actually define a misuse in a democratic setting? And I suggest, because then anything could be actually misuse. All sorts of radical politics could be construed as misuse. I am suggesting a different reading, rather than going in the direction of misuse. I think that what we are experiencing in these culture wars is actually a certain strategy that makes a lot of sense, rather than misuse, rather than something that we could moralize and define as wrong, or we could probably speak about something different. And I am taking the position of Olivier Roy and his last but one book, Le Repétel Chrétien, is Europe Still Christian, I think was the English translation, in which actually he takes the frame of culture wars and tries to make sense of what these religious actors, church and not church, non-church religious actors are doing. And he makes observation that you can or not accept of a thoroughgoing secularization of culture, not only of those social systems, Durkheimian social systems, and of intellectual sphere, but also of everyday culture after the 1960s. And I'm going very quickly through this thesis, and he explains that in his view, churches in Europe, now we are firmly in Western Europe, face choice of strategy. Either they accept the secularized modernity and they self-secularize, like European Lutherans tend to do, or they choose a sort of countercultural seculusion within the walls of religion, in which they continue to live the world they prefer, they prefer not secularize, which would be the so-called the Benedict option. And finally, there is a third option that Olivier Roy describes as things that what is happening in his diagnosis, and this is a spiritual reconquest, he would say, of the secularized or pagan society through all sorts of means, not only pastoral, missionary, and this is the important thing, but also by political means. When I was reading this book 2 years ago, I found this thesis quite stark. But when you look at what is actually happening also in the Czech Republic and around us, there is some reality to it. So What would this mean? It would mean actually not only, I mean, one fight for, one kind of reconquest would be for the churches to actually reimpose something of what is linked, what counters secularization. And the examples of this kind of counter politics, they are more and more numerous in Central Europe, definitely Poland, in Hungary, in Slovakia, more, and in the Czech Republic too. So, when we look at these culture wars that I've described previously, they're not just, we don't have to see them as some kind of a new conflict in societies that are always full of some kinds of conflicts, but we can also see them, and this is something that we've been working on with my colleague in the Faculty of Arts, as also a certain type of counter strategy of groups that have seen themselves as minorities. For example, these populist parties that have defined their position as national groups that are victimized by post-national Europe, or as religious groups that are victimized by these secular societies. And we have seen a coalition between religious and populist, nationalist, nativist groups that actually share a very similar strategy of a counter-hegemonic policy in which they try to change not politics per se through elections, but the way we talk about politics, the way we think about politics, through discursive means, and through and the way we organize society through social norms. So what we've seen in these culture wars that I've described before, without giving, unfortunately, too many examples because I have no time, we actually do see this kind of a counter-hegemonic strategy in which not necessarily churches, but very often these civil society organizations develop a discourse that translate a sort of Christian anthropology, non-modernist, anti-modernist Christian anthropology into modern language means, and that pit this position against what I call social constructivism, especially in terms of gender issues. We also see these actors bring in discursive means that are in principle anti-modern, but that are dressed as a common sense positions to make them acceptable to in public discourse. So this is something that we can observe. In a more political in the political sphere. This counter-hegemonic strategy is much more visible. We actually observe coalitions of religiously inspired civil society organizations with with populist right, often also with like extreme right or very radical right in countries around us, in Central and Eastern Europe, that actually seek to use this influence through parliaments or governments to gain positions in schools, in government bodies, and in media, to spread a certain discourse that I've just sketched earlier. And the most visible kind of this is why possibly Olivia Roy speaks about reconquest. Legal means are used to actually reimpose a certain social order that is deemed to support this anti-modernist position, usually defining public morality positions through laws, through prohibitions or through impositions. So we see the prohibition of abortion, we see the prohibition of same-sex marriage, of gender change and so on, in which they stand in stark contrast to the liberal camp that actually seeks the opposite. What does this mean? Would we see this as a misuse or as a strategy? I would side with Olivia Roy, understanding this attempt to redefine in anti-modern ways social order as an order based on certain ideas that come from Christian anthropology, as a fight over norms, And as a fight over norms that can be partly successful, but that in the end actually reinforces the secularization process. In the fact that when you focus on norms, meaning on legal norms, laws, or explicit norms, you first have to always frame it in a secular language, because it has to at least appear universal. You have to make it very explicit, which is something that brings you against the practice, the cultural practice that is usually based on implicit norms. And also you recognize by making things explicit that this implicit culture has gone. Once people don't tend to abide by certain values and norms by themselves, are forced to do it by explicit norms, it actually there is a recognition that this implicit anthropological basis of a Catholic culture has gone, and then you need to replace it with an explicit norm of the legal means. And it also means that these organizations have chosen identity over values, meaning cultural symbols that are fought about in many of those culture wars, from Bavarian crucifixes to all those laws. They very explicitly in the decision in the verdicts of, for example, the European Court of Human Rights, they explicitly define Christian symbols as cultural norms, as cultural heritage, as something that is merely of this tradition and that doesn't have any does no longer have any religious, moral, or other appeal, other than this kind of importance of heritage. And it makes Christianity into what Rogers Brubaker calls Christianism, a political identitarian ideology that defines what is ours against that which is not ours, for example, Islam or the secular. And that organizes, that makes religion a basis of mobilization for all sorts of political actors, including, for example, the radical right populists who were who were often not far ago pagan or anti-clerical, and who have not embraced faith in the process, but they have embraced symbols, Christian symbols, as a definition of identity. So there is a loss. So what Olivia Roa sees in this process is actually loss of religion. So I would not speak about misuse of religion, because even when we think in terms of secularization, in the secular setting, where we could actually define something as religious and ask ourselves if there is abuse or misuse. First, in a democratic society, it's very difficult to define something as abusive or because democratic society are ultimately values and norms of a democratic society are ultimately matters of debate and consensus. So all positions should be invited to take part in this debate. So this is the first problem. A second problem is religion itself. I mean, is it religion still? When we are speaking about Christianism, is it still religion? Possibly not. Also, those cultural war actors do attack some basic norms of democratic society or democratic coexistence, but like equality, individual autonomy, but they never do it explicitly, right? So they never do it overtly. They formally play this democratic game, so they can't be really taken away from it. What is interesting about these the presence of religious actors is actually, I think, that it highlights that democracy has certain epistemic foundation. Modern democracy that thinks in terms of individual autonomy and equality has some epistemic foundations, and they are weaker than we could have thought. And finally, I think I would speak more about instrumentalization rather than misuse of religion, in which religious actors become political actors, wielding some symbolic and discursive power. And the more they wield symbolic and discursive power and this is the prediction by Olivia Roa, the more they wield this symbolic and discursive power, the more they can actually weaken the very power of their symbols and norms, as long as they're not framed as values, meaning acting by example, but as norms that are supposed to be imposed on the others. So instrumentalization would be my diagnosis, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for your diagnosis. Questions? Peter.
I hope you don't mind that I would like to criticize your fundamental approach. What I missed in your presentation is to make a distinction between secularization, which is indeed a fundamental principle of modernity, and secularism, which is an ideology which also came up, especially during the Enlightenment, and is still increasingly present in our days. You're a political scientist, so I only need to refer to the ideas of John Rawls, who explicitly makes this distinction. The consequence is that, from my perspective at least, there is a strong tendency nowadays that you have to be secular. So, and that there's an increasing intolerance towards religion. So, whereas the principle of secularization implies basically the distinction between state and church and pluralism, well, what we experience is a decrease in the acceptance of pluralism. So, I'm of course not favoring religious cultural wars, etc., etc. That doesn't make sense. But I would argue that the opposition of churches and religious communities, but also of nationalistic movements, ethnic movements, against some of the implications of secularism, is not so much a misuse, but a very, well, I would put it perhaps a bit provocatively, legitimate defense of their values against an increasingly secularist society. Could you, well, that's a completely different perspective, I realize, but could you comment on that, please?
Thank you. Actually, I would not delegitimize the religious voice or the Christian voice per se. It's part of the democratic debate. I'm not also sure about the increasingly secularist societies. I would, it is possible that, from a point of, that it's possible that certain recent changes can be framed as such, as, but the question is whether, or I will counter with a third notion: secularization as a sociological process, secularism as a political principle, and secularity would be actually the field in which it should be possible to limit the effects of secularism. I mean, for example, when I hear secularism, I think of France and its relation to Islam, for example, or secularist policies that are really anti-religion in some sense. I don't know what to make of it actually in our context, in which it would what to make of secularist politics in our context. I would be a proponent of secularity, meaning a shared framework of plural positions, in which it should be possible to actually discuss both the possibly negative effects of what some could see as as secularist politics, and in which also some religious positions would also be themselves limited by the principles of equality and pluralism. So there is a space in which these principles can clash, and I think they do clash in many of those issues I've mentioned. They clash, and there is a legitimate debate about these clashes. It's not. I would not take one side or the other, because I think a lot of these debates are very legitimate. But what I was trying to say, I would actually found it more productive if these debates were held in a different framework than this cultural framework, which is a framework of imposition of power. And if actually we continued to share people of different backgrounds, if we continue to share a common epistemology, meaning if we could actually speak about rights when we speak about rights, and if we could speak about moral values or, for example, consequences for society. I mean, some of these issues that I've mentioned, immigration, but also gender issues, actually do have consequences for the majority, let's say. And it's very legitimate to actually raise them. What I don't see, unfortunately, is we don't have a lot of, at least here in Central and Eastern, we don't have a lot of debates in which all sides would be on the same page, would use the same language, would actually try to understand each other, and would actually express themselves so that the position of one could be reflected and respected by the other. This is not happening. We are now in a situation of these culture wars in which one wants to impose a vision upon the other, which is actually very, very negative, which is in itself. So I would the defense against secularist policies, I think this a democratic society should have space for that, and would have space for it in a context of in what Charles Taylor calls secularity. So I think that we should think in this direction.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 2 questions, and if try to be short enough to give the whole lecture as answers.
Yeah. So I'm under pressure to put a short question, but I have a very long question. I appreciate very much that term instrumentalization. I think this is bringing us closer to discussion, and I would like to ask: this term of secularization was invented by the clergy. Clergy, especially Catholic clergy, after the French Revolution, when they lost the power in the society. So they were trying to describe a new society where they have no power as a secular and as a society against religion. Basically, they were just trying to protect and prevent themselves from losing the privileges. So in Roman languages, they use more terms: lay state and clerical state. Clerical state, especially when I see it in Slovakia and with the population where the majority is Catholic, that Catholic Church is trying to impose certain principles from canon law also in the state legislation, and this is making out of that religious state or religious ideas actually clerical ideas. And as the opposite, they see the lay state, the secular society in your terms or in that usual understanding. So don't you think that would be better to use those 2 terms, lay and clerical, in order to avoid the secular when modernization of the society is seen as something negative, because to be religious and to be believer is something good. And when they see that the secularization is something what is negative, that's why they see that, or they feel that resistance. And I have a couple of examples where, for example, NGOs, faith-based NGOs, and this is newest example in Slovak Parliament, when they are trying to put into legislation obligatory consent of parents with the sexual education of their kids. And it should be explicitly signed by parents. And they named even certain authors. It was even the Slovak Academy of Science named among those publications which are not good for parenthood and and teaching. They see as a framework for partnership in the marriage. And this is something what is already clear when confessional teaching is becoming a part of state legislation. So I think that would be. What do you think of it?
Can we one more question? Yes.
I will ask the question during the break. That's fine. I think.
No, ask question. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the brilliant analysis. I'm really impressed. I was puzzled by two things. The word strategy, which I really like, and I understand your proposal. At the same time, it implies some kind of conscious method or trying to achieve a certain goal. I'm not sure whether some of those processes you were describing are actually led by a conscious strategy. Trying to achieve a particular goal. Who is the will behind it? Not always. I think that would be very clear. And second thing, very shortly, I'm just wondering and hoping, in a sense, that what is going on right now in Ukraine might also provide some of those rather conservative. Religious leaders another strong reason to rethink their strategies. Because I think what is going on, besides other things, is it is discrediting this sort of merging religion and politics. And it is, I hope it is a major factor in discrediting some of the processes and strategies you were describing. I'm not sure, maybe it's not naive.
This is the bell of end of your lecture.
So thank you. So very clearly, I think lay and clerical. This was the French terms when secularization, political secularism was introduced in a very Catholic society, against cultural hegemony, basically. Cultural hegemony was still Catholic, and politics was already Republican. I see why you say this about Slovakia, because Slovakia is in a similar position. Cultural hegemony is Catholic, and then there is a fight about the state. But clerical is now used in a very actually in politics it's a negative term. I mean, it could be positive from within the church perspective, something clerical, but from within politics it's very negative. So clerical state would be negative, and lay state would, I think, in a democracy that has no confession, it would not really help. It would actually give the whole. It would actually reinforce the religious dimension of politics to use. And actually, we could also maybe speak about secularity as something. There is a positive. I mean, secularization can be construed as negative for religious actors, but secularity is increasingly seen as a necessity for religious freedom. Actually, for many religious actors, especially in the situation of abuse of religion or merge between religion and politics, like we see in the East, and sometimes maybe in around our neighbors, then secularity can be construed as something very positive, meaning a possibility of coexistence of religious and non-religious actors in a framework in which gives both freedom and ways of negotiating their differences. So maybe I would suggest finding something more creative than lay and clerical. And I believe also that when you have a merger of politics and religion, people get disabused on an intellectual level. So Iran is an example. There is a thoroughgoing secularization in Iran intellectually, but on the political level, I mean, in terms of institutional influence, this is a much longer and more difficult process of disentangling. And I think once there is a merger, it makes it very difficult to actually go this way. But the intellectual, theological also, I would, or in media, I think, or among young people, I think this, and I would also agree with you.